Welcome to this week's Desk Side Chat. This week, the topic of conversation is growth through acquisition and partnership. During our Desk Side Chat today, we are joined by Dan Davis, founder of ADK and Financial Planning World. Dan, appreciate you joining us today.
My pleasure. What's going on, John?
Oh, all kinds of stuff. We're going to get into this topic, and you and I have discussed some of the things that you've gone through in your career, both good and bad, some experiences that you've had in terms of acquiring and partnering with other advisors. And I think we really can lean on a lot of the experience and expertise that you bring to the table and things that you're looking to do as you continue growing your firm going forward, Dan. Definitely would appreciate your insight. So I guess if you wouldn't mind, just to start, if you could provide just a little background on yourself and your experience in the business up to this point.
Certainly. So started in the industry in the late 80s as a college intern. Knew I wanted to come into this space, but really didn't know what financial planning was. It was a burgeoning industry at that stage. So we spent about a decade with a large firm that was doing financial planning, but more as a sales process than a true advice process. We left around 98 to start up our own independent firm where we felt like we could be advice driven and not product driven, but have access to a full array of independent products. And then in 2015, we decided to take that next step of independence to set up our own RIA. So we're set up as a hybrid and have done some things that have worked really well that have positioned us at this stage in the career where I'm really satisfied with where we're at and where we're headed, but made a lot of mistakes that were costly. So if I can share some of those successes and mistakes with others that help them, that would be great time used.
Yeah, I think that would be extremely helpful to just get again, you've been down the road, Dan. You've seen, kind of again some of the good and the bad. But I guess before we even get into that, as your business has evolved, as you got into this place where you were more comfortable with the organic growth that you've built, if there's an advisor out there who's watching this and listening in, at what point do you think it makes sense to start looking outside and looking at opportunities beyond just simply the organic client acquisition process?
I think that it depends on someone's understanding of the industry and their financial ability. So, for example, someone who's 5 years in, but really has a true grasp and is pretty mature, they might be in a different position than I was at year 5. At year 5, I didn't know enough to really start thinking about acquiring other practices. I was still trying to learn all the different kinds of products and the processes and all that. So for me to buy something at year 5 would have been a colossal financial mistake. But there's other people who maybe are much further along in their life journey at 5 years than I was. At 5 years, I was like 27 years old. So where you're at skill level and from an astute business standpoint drives a lot of it. And then financially, I mean, you're in a situation where when you go out and start to acquire now, you're looking at needing to have somewhere between a third and a little bit more than a third as a down payment. So access to capital, either your own money or a BD that's willing to front some of that. Some of the broker dealers are able to front a down payment with some skin in the game from you. Others front it all, others don't do any. So, all those things play into that. And then you have to realize when you make an acquisition, if you onboard with a key employee, which is to me a best practice model, because that person keeps relationships where the retiring or exiting person is gone, then you're really in a cash flow neutral position, because a lot of your payments that you're making for the acquisition are with after tax money. And so you're receiving revenue from the acquisition. You're paying tax on that, but you're having to pay the monthly note on a pre-tax basis. So cash flow becomes a really big deal. It's like in a market turn right now, we're buying literally right in the middle of a close that closes in about 10 days. And, the valuation was done in January. So the January didn't see any of this downturn. So now we've got a significant downturn in the market. So what we're going to be using depends on how long. So there's just a lot to it. So I would sum all that up by saying you need to be financially solvent and solid, and you need to know really the business before you start thinking about acquisitions.
And it's interesting you say that, because so many people, I don't know if they start too early or just have that mindset of just, this is the only way to go. I have to do this, and maybe don't have a lot of that experience, or maybe aren't in the best financial position and end up kind of putting themselves into a quarter, and they're in a tough spot. And it ends up making things more challenging than it needs to be, certainly going forward. Can you walk us through? So I want to get into this current practice that you're acquiring, but can you walk us through what you've experienced in the past, Dan, and in what that process looked like specific to you, and again, some of the good and bad? I know you've talked to me a little bit about some things that didn't go as well as you would have liked, but as much as you'd be comfortable sharing, we would appreciate it.
Well, the first merger that we were involved in would have been in probably 96. Yeah, 96 thereabouts. And what the biggest mistake we made is we looked around at the people in the ecosystem that we were all serving in. And we then decided we were going to take as many of the A players that were top producers, put them on a team thinking that we would have the dream team. But what we didn't really think about was team chemistry. And the chemistry of that team was nothing but negative. There were 5 people on that team. 3 had great chemistry. They were givers, and 2 of them were takers. And it ended up in what you would classify as a dissolution of a partnership that was a distraction for a year, probably cost me upwards of $500,000 of money that I didn't have at that particular stage. So it took out a cash flow over a period of time. And it was really a crushing blow at that stage in my career. It wasn't obviously career ending, but it took me to my knees with a hand on my throat, squeezing pretty tight. So I would say, don't think of mergers in terms of best players. Think of it in terms of players that bring synergy and have chemistry. And if you can do that, then a merger works. If not, you're just sort of basically taking round pegs and square holes and just jamming them together, and it's messy.
We probably don't have time to get into a lot of the details, but just at a high level, in that particular experience you're describing, was that coming together under a single organization? Was it ensemble? How did that structure, how did you put that together as you were trying to put this dream team together?
Yeah, we were working we were moving in an ensemble practice mode, and it was one single entity where everything was shared income, expenses, different roles, etc. And to say that it didn't work would be an exaggeration. So, you take a 6 months to a year to figure out that it's not working, and then it takes 6 months to a year to unravel it, because it's messy when you're all baked in like that together.
In your own words, you said it, brought you to your knees. It was very challenging, difficult time for you. I mean, at that time, did you think you would ever go back down that road again, given how challenging that was?
Yeah, I did, because I believed in it. It was just one of those learning lessons that I had been on teams before in a sport environment, but not in a work environment. And I didn't mentally translate that they're really the same thing, just a different objective. One's a game, one's a business. So what it helped me do is really realize, hey, all those things that you learn from being on teams, they're completely transferable to the business world. It's not just some kind of, academic exercise. It's really real. And so then the three of us that were very compatible continued on together, and it worked very well for a while. Where it then hit a crossroad was when we hit a certain level of success. The three individuals had different ideas of how they wanted to springboard that success. So one wanted to sort of move upstream and go to higher net worth. Another wanted to spend more time hunting and fishing. And I was in a position where I wanted to be incrementally going upstream. So we got to another point where that three became two. That was a very different breakup, in that the three of us were givers. None of us wanted the other one to feel like we felt after that last breakup occurred. So we had very candid conversations about where do we want to go, how are we going to do that. When we realized that it wasn't compatible, we then basically had a very good dialogue about how we would become separate entities. And it worked out. It took about 2 years because of loans, taxes, all kinds of stuff for the true complete separation. And in the midst of all that, we renewed leases together, shared real estate. It was the difference between being in a partnership with a giver versus a partnership with a taker. It's almost like a marriage. And so when that partnership wasn't going to work anymore and you have givers, you can figure it out because no one's trying to make sure that they end up with a bigger piece of the cheese pie. So, but after that occurred, we then moved away from ensemble and into silos. And we needed to do that at that particular stage because one of the individuals wanted what I would classify as a practice that allowed him to do what he wanted to do other than work. And in my situation, I don't have those kind of hobbies, and I wanted to build at a different rate level and work rate. And that worked out really well. And the two of those people with 80K are still in a siloed business firm, 80K Wealth Advisory Group. The website's Discover Independence. And then when it got to the point where I really wanted to build something that was going to be more of an ensemble type of scenario, we started with Financial Planning World, which the website for that's financialplanningworld.com.
So there's obviously a lot of challenges in finding the right business for, and there's so many different variables to consider. Certainly one of them is finding the right people, both the advisor as well as staff, as you mentioned earlier, and making sure there's going to be good synergy. What are some of the best ways that you've found to source and find those opportunities?
So you're talking about finding individuals to be on the team, or are you talking about finding practices to acquire?
Either way, I guess we could go either way with that, but more, I guess, on the practice side, if you're looking to acquire and bring on, I mean, you could bring on a person that may have a book as well, but let's start with the practice side.
So much of acquiring a practice is a dating process to determine, are you going to get engaged? And then are you going to get married? And so the dating process, for one seller, I'm told there's 30 to 40 buyers that throw their hat in the ring at this particular stage. So you've got this debutante, and then you've got all these suitors that are coming around. And how does that seller weed through the ones that are serious and then the ones that he or she wants to decide through? And that part of it, I would say I've not been through, so I can't really breathe into that. But from a standpoint of being on the buyer side, I can breathe into that because that's something that I've done quite a bit of. Number one, you have to realize there are certain deals you don't want to buy. Just because they have a decent amount of AUM doesn't mean you want it. So we had a deal that would have closed about 3 years ago. And after we finished our due diligence, we just realized the way that this person had it set up was not compatible with how we would onboard it and serve it, and it was going to be too much of a distraction. So while we made it to the final person, and we're at that stage where we were working through all the details of it, we then backed out at the engagement level so that we didn't get married. And the reason why, again, is it wasn't really going to be compatible. I just had enough internal weirdness. Like when I'm trying to make major decisions like that, because I'm a person of faith, I'll be praying about it. Like, give me peace if this is really the right thing for me. And then if it's not, give me a feeling of unease, because I don't get an uneasy feeling very often. I'm pretty much charged, take the hill, let's rock and roll. But when I get that, I pay attention to it. And I had that a couple different times. And the net effect of it was that we walked away from that deal. And I'm glad we did. The person who bought it's a friend of mine. And I've heard nothing but, wow, what a pain in the arse that's been for him. So the deal that we're on right now really confirmed that for me, at our stage, because we're at about 750 million of AUM. And I'm told between where we're at now and probably $1 billion to $1.5 billion, as Dan Sullivan calls it, is really a ceiling of complexity. It's really a hard push through. But once you're on the other side of that $1 billion to $1.5 billion, it's probably it's never easy, but you're not bumping your head a lot. And so for us to have a failed deal would be a really very, very challenging, because we don't have enough human resource to sort of muddle through that. So what we've decided is we're working to acquire regionally specific, either in St. Louis or Nashville, because that's where we have a presence. St. Louis, we have a stronger presence because that's where our headquarters is, where a bunch of our employees and teammates are. And I'm the only one in Nashville. We could do a deal in Nashville, but it would stress the entity over here. So geographic is important. The next thing that we decided is we did not want to buy something that's not on the same custodial ecosystem that we're on. And so then that limits who we're looking at. So we're not looking at Schwab and Fidelity and some of these others now. Down the road, we will, because as a hybrid, we can custody assets at multiple places. But we intentionally decided we're only using one custodian at this point. So that really narrows it down. You've got a specific custodian and you've got a very specific region. So then, because we have a reputation inside of that system, if you will, we just started a very targeted approach where we do videos that we send out regularly, and it's using constant contact. And then we follow up with a phone call to the advisors that are in those regions. So we send out to, like, I want to say it's 30 target cities. We send out that constant contact blip, because there's mergers and there's acquisitions. And what we're talking about right now is acquisitions. We can only acquire in those two cities or metro areas, but we could have mergers where people come into our hybrid, keep doing what they're doing, and use a sleeve of our services like compliance, and we charge an override for that. That's simple. When I say that, they're not really merging into our office. They're just basically merging into our hybrid to use a sleeve of services. We still would be selective in that, but not nearly as selective as in the acquisition mode. And so from that acquisition, we then narrow it down to people who, one, are interested, two, are potential sellers. And then we just engage in a process. This particular one took a year of those dating conversations to turn into an engagement. And then from the engagement to the close, it's about a year.
I was going to ask on the time frame. So, and I like your analogy: dating, engagement, marriage. So that's typical. You'd say, a year of dating, right? I mean, I guess that one that
depends on the seller. I mean, what's the seller's motive and what's their time frame? because if someone has an illness, it's going to drive that dating process and that engagement process to be a lot shorter. But if they're thinking about retiring, a lot of times they're not in nearly as big of a hurry.
And it sounds like I was also going to ask, with your constant contact, you mentioned determining if they're sellers. So these aren't people who have a business listed for sale necessarily. These are advisors that either are selling or maybe on the cusp of putting the business up. Correct?
So the way that this particular relationship began was through what I had just mentioned. We do use a couple different systems where someone who's a seller is announcing that they're selling through a particular, whether it's Succession Link or whatever, and they're pushing out FP transitions, and then we'll respond to those. But what I'm finding more often than not is that that because we're very specific regionally, there have been very few people selling in those areas that have advertised through that medium.
Not to mention, as you mentioned, 30 or 40 buyers per seller. When you're reaching
Right.
out, it's, everybody and their brothers doing the same thing in those situations. And so, if you can get ahead of that, and if you can establish that relationship ahead of time, or at least have a presence, is
Right.
important. So I think it really speaks well to what your process of being very targeted, and then also just letting people know who you are, what you're about.
Right.
So when the time is right.
Exactly.
So let's talk a little bit then, if you're comfortable, on this, current situation. So this was the one you said dating was about a year, and then, this engagement period was about a year to get to this
Right.
point.
Right. And we knew each other prior to the dating. So it wasn't it still was cool, wasn't cold, because we didn't know each other well. We knew each other through a variety of different, kind of systems that are not systems, but meetings that had taken place within our brand, and not my brand, but the brand that we're connected with. And the net effect of that was we had a relationship of respect, and he knew and I knew the reputation of each other.
And you mentioned, as we're kind of entering in this period of more market uncertainty, volatility, and so forth, how did you analyze or put forth the potential stress testing of what this would look like? Because we're coming out of this, very long period where that wasn't, it should have always been a consideration, but it wasn't, it didn't become as relevant as it is now. So how did you really put together, again, stress tests, and kind of look at what was going to be feasible depending on where the market goes?
So Sam Miller and I are the founders of Financial Planning World. And Sam literally went through and looked at the last 3 years of cash flow for the business. And then what we did is we looked at how much of it was reoccurring and how much of it was commission. And then we sort of did some modeling out, best case scenario, moderate scenario, worst case scenario. And, if something really bad happens, markets don't do what they're supposed to do. This person had a partner before. What if a bunch of them jump ship and want that person? Those kinds of things. And that particular scenario was sobering, because if that happened, we'd really be buying into something that we would have regretted. So then it gets down to, are you willing to live with that risk? And we were. So we spent a lot of time up front with the buyer and understanding the risk of that relationship. We had the key person, a guy named Justin, who's really liked by the clients, that we knew he would be coming aboard with us. And then we signed some non-solicitation so that he couldn't solicit those clients if for some reason he left and went with that previous partner. So there were a lot of things that we did to reduce that risk.
But, as you said, it comes down to, making sure it's the right person, or, getting to know, the person at a level where, I liked how you described it. You pray about it, you have good peace of mind and feelings about it. If you don't, you have that unease, then it's not going to be the right deal. So I guess given that, how quickly will you sort through potential opportunities or realize that something is just not a fit? How quickly are you able to assess and kind of go through that so you're not, wasting time during that dating process?
I don't know that I would say that we have an efficient process yet for that. So for me, it was about 4 months where we were really getting real information. So the beginning of the dating process is not real information. It's a lot of how much do you have at AUM? It's superficial. And so then I think once the person really says, hey, this is who I want, then you enter into this non-disclosure arrangement where you then the hood's up and you're really looking. And at that stage, it took me about 3 months of being able to truly understand what does he really have, and is it something compatible with what we do? Because it's not 100% perfect fit. There's a lot of things that are more like this than like this, and so then you start to say, okay, well, can we do that long term, or do we have to turn it like this? And if so, how long does that take? So, for example, we do our own in-house modeling and our own in-house money management, and he does all of that, not all of it, but the majority of it third party. And so the reality of it is very different investment chassis. He does the financial planning, the client relationship, identical to what we did. And so, that once we really understood that, we had to then say, can we live with that? Because you're not just going to go in and pull levers and move it from there to here in day one. So 3 months was how long it took me. I think someone who does this regularly could do it faster if you had a process, but we're developing that process. I won't be able to do another acquisition for at least 2 years because it's going to take a while for us to really assimilate this in. And now we're now at a point where all of our client care teams are maxed out. We still have a little bit of what I'll call crisis bandwidth, but we're in a crisis, and so that bandwidth is gone. And so we're hiring a person in May that comes aboard with us that's going to basically become a financial advisor. They'll start off as a paraplanner, but it's going to take a while for that person to really get up and running and trained. My experience is it takes, for that skill level, it takes a year for that person to really be valuable. The first 6 months, they're reliant on the other people on the team. The next 6 months, they're quasi-independent. And after a year, they're really able to run stuff.
So, as you said earlier, you haven't really, been in the position of somebody selling, so you can't speak to exactly, what that might feel or be like. But, if you put yourself in the shoes of somebody on the other side, at what point should somebody that is either, contemplate or looking to sell, at what point should they reach out to you or reach out to somebody, from their viewpoint? How would you try to look at things and look at opportunities? Because again, there's so many buyers out there. There's so many different ways to go. There's good and bad and challenges. How would you try to, I guess, whittle that process down if you were on that side?
So for me, it would be 3 years out. I would basically do a year's worth of dating, and then I would probably whittle it down to 2 or 3 of my top contenders. I wouldn't go to one. And so in that top 3 contending before engagement, I would go pretty deep in with those 3 to select it down to one. So and then I would, at the back end of it, I would have a year where I sold and stayed. And the reason I would do that is I would want, for me, one of my values is my clients really being cared for. I think that doing a lot of joint meetings and still being there for a little bit of time, but only being there to support, not in a advisor role. That's how I would do it. And then the other thing is that when I narrowed it down to those few, I would then be really, really not looking at who's offering the best price, but I'd be looking at who's got the best team that can truly take care of the clients that I have.
That makes sense. And again, it's about the relationships, the relationships with the clients, the relationships between buyers and sellers, mergers and acquisitions on both sides. And if you do it right, the sell and stay, like you described, if you do it right, everybody wins, including the clients, which is so important. And it's, one of the things that has motivated me to go out and build this cause out is just looking at so many advisors out there have painted themselves into a corner, some more senior advisors, where I feel like in the coming years, their options will be limited to just one of the big aggregators, right? I mean, that they're just going to have to pull a trigger pretty quickly without having that 3-year process, without having that plan ahead of time. And so one of the things we're hoping to do is provide expertise, provide insight, and really provide an example for advisors, or many examples, hopefully, on how to do things in a way that, again, serves all parties, buyer, seller, and clients.
Agreed. We had a person merge in with us last year, and the reason that they moved from their previous RA to ours was they could tell that entity was not the entity that they would ultimately sell to, and they're not planning on selling for another decade. But they also wanted to make sure if they died or become disabled, that whoever they were connected with was that entity that they would want to sell to. So I thought that individual played it extraordinarily well, and that was someone that I've known because I went to high school with them. We then studied finance together. He went a different track than what I went, and then later came into the retail side of financial planning, and ultimately he was able to do his due diligence a lot quicker because he's had family members that were clients of our firm. So he's already known what we're all about for a while. But for those people you were alluding to, I would recommend that they consider some merger at a previous point, and not a merger like it's like it. There are mergers and acquisitions that really end up being like this. You can also merge where you still stay completely autonomous and independent, where your culture doesn't weave into theirs. It connects in more like a Lego than like a grapevine. And if you're able to do that, you get a really good look into, over a long period of time, however long you want, which is kind of like dating,
And it gives you that opportunity to potentially do some maybe joint work or bring clients in,
Right.
and really,
Right.
again, get that good client experience, which is going to make it all the more successful for everyone.
Agreed.
All right. Well, we'll wrap up this one-on-one portion. We'll see if any members want to jump in and contribute as well. But Dan, really appreciate you joining us this week. I know you're busy. You had a lot going on, but definitely appreciate the opportunity to tap into your expertise. Thank you so much for joining us.
Very welcome.